and welcome back to What the H Are You Reading? I'm your host, Brian Heinz. Welcome back to What the H Are You Reading for November 2020. We're going to do 4 quickie reviews, 1 comic for each week of the month. Let's begin with week number 1 and Batman number 102. Now, I'm trying to read more DC, so I jumped into Batman. I was a big fan of current writer James Tynion IV's Rebirth run on Detective Comics. This arc is post-Joker War, which was the title's last big storyline. Now, there's a new supporting character I'm not familiar with in the book called the Clown Killer, who's a teenager who's been going around killing members of the Joker's gang. Also, Barbara Gordon is back to playing Oracle instead of Batgirl, although I'm sure she can still walk unless I've missed something really big. And Nightwing, Spoiler, and Orphan, and even Harley Quinn are currently supporting cast members in the book. What's happening now is that the Batman finds a group of the Joker's thugs all murdered. We then have a flashback to when Bruce was training to become Batman. He tries to get training from one of the world's great knife experts, but he's interrupted by a masked man who apparently knows him, knows his story about his dead parents, about his wealth. And Bruce knows this man too, saying that he murdered their mutual teacher back in Morocco before a fight breaks out. Back in modern day, Harley Quinn is trying to rent an apartment in Gotham, but she's being observed by Clown Killer, who in turn is interrupted by the man from Bruce's flashback, except now he's wearing very elaborate armor and armed with 2 swords. That person in turn is interrupted by Batman, who calls the man Ghostmaker. Bruce reminds him that he promised to stay out of Gotham City, but Ghostmaker says Bruce has failed in his war on crime. He wants to take over crime fighting in Gotham City and permanently incapacitate or even kill Gotham City supervillains. And he's willing to duel Bruce for that right. Now, the story is very fast-paced, but if you're like me, you're just jumping into the middle of Tynion's run, so you've got a lot of loose ends that you don't understand. Mostly who this Clown Killer character is, but also what is Harley doing in Gotham and why is Barbara Oracle again? I think adding a new chapter to Bruce's past and bringing a new villain out of that era, one who knows Bruce's secrets, is a good enough hook to keep me reading. The art by Carlo Pagliulian is very nice. He does wonderful character art, weapons, fight scenes, etc. My only real problem with the book is Harley Quinn. She feels a little too over the top. I know, but hear me out. It's more like her big expressions and the bright colors she possesses don't really seem to fit in with the more somber color palette and the darker personalities of the Batman comic. So while I'm going to keep reading the forthcoming issues of Batman, I suggest if you want to read this title, go back to the beginning of Tynion's run. That way you know why certain characters are where they are and why they're acting the way they act. Because those answers are in the past issues. They're not going to be in the forthcoming issues. And for week 2, it's Hellboy and the BPRD, the 7 Wives Club. Possibly the greatest living comic book artist of this day is Adam Hughes. Now, for a long time, he fell into the cover trap. That is to say that when an artist hits a certain level of notoriety and fame, they only start producing covers. It happens. You're in demand. You get paid a lot of money to produce one piece of art, and you've got a whole month to do it instead of having to pull out 24, 28 pages, however long a comic is, in the course of 1 month. Don't get me wrong, it's a sweet deal, but if we, the readers, get lucky, occasionally those A-list artists miss doing sequential storytelling and come back to interiors. Adam's been fairly active over the last few years with interior art, working on Before Watchmen, Dr. Manhattan, Betty and Veronica, The Ride, and then last year he drew a Hellboy one-shot called Krampusnacht. Well, it went over well and won a few Eisner Awards, so Mike Mignola has written another Hellboy one-shot and Adam Hughes is drawing it again. Like my earlier review of The Beast of Varga, this one-shot is part of the Hellboy and the BPRD comic book line. It's called The 7 Wives Club. In the 90s, dude! Hellboy and BPRD agent Pauline Raskin investigated a girl who killed her boyfriend after the couple spent a night in a haunted house, where a man supposedly killed his 7 lovers and then committed suicide. This leads them to a man whose mother was one of 7 nurses who performed the dead man's autopsy and, as a prank of sorts, stole his body. From there, it's the 2 agents trying to reclaim the man's body and surviving a ghostly attack by his dead wives. The coloring, also done by Adam Hughes, is astounding, and the book goes from gloomy and dark to bright yet claustrophobic over the course of a few pages. Like most Hellboy stories, we'll never know what really happened 100%. Hellboy's more about walking into the middle of a storm and then just trying to calm things down, as it were. And while for a long time Adam Hughes was known as a babe artist, and yes, he does draw good-looking women, he also draws good-looking men, monsters, ghosts. His expression work on faces is astounding. This is a very fun read. This comic has been on the pricier side at $5, but for a book full of Adam Hughes art, more than worth it. And the story by Mignola is the usual Hellboy quirkiness that we don't fully understand but thoroughly enjoy. For week 3, it's Juggernaut number 3. What do you do when you've spent years surrounded by mutants, then all of a sudden they move to their own island and you're not allowed on it? The current Juggernaut miniseries by Fabian Nicieza and drawn by Ron Garney asks this question. The Juggernaut was trapped in limbo right before the whole mutants Krakoa nation thing happened, and we see in flashbacks how he escaped, got repowered, but then stepbrother Charles tells him he's not allowed on Krakoa since it's mutants only. He gets a job destroying old buildings until he meets a young girl with powers and tries to help her, all the while she's trying to make him a social media star, and he has to confront his past mistakes. This issue shows him on trial for the destruction of property way back in those famous issues of Amazing Spider-Man when he ended up getting trapped in concrete. He then has to save this superpowered girl he's been mentoring named D-Cell from a giant female Sandman before finding out that the current supervillain prison is being used by Nazi scientist Arnim Zola from Captain America comics as a testing ground for superhuman experimentation. The Kane Marco we're seeing here is once again trying to be a good guy while the whole world just doesn't want to see the Juggernaut as anything more than a huge threat. Again, you can't help but draw a parallel between his plan and that of mutants, but since his power is magical in nature, he'll never be part of the mutants, so he's an outsider among outsiders. The story is okay, it just seems to lack edge or bite. We might have finally gotten some much-needed focus for the last few issues of this miniseries with the introduction of Arnim Zola and his unethical experiments, but prior to this it was just him trying to find his purpose in the world. Bounce against a bunch of flashbacks that show how he got to this miniseries from where we left him at the end of an Uncanny X-Men run that frankly not a lot of people were reading. But there's also zero connection to his current appearance and imprisonment in Amazing Spider-Man, so we don't have to worry about that, I guess. Although in that book he's a villain. Here he's a hero, or trying to be. For the last 2 decades or so, the Juggernaut has bounced between both roles. I can understand not wanting to lose such a good antagonist, and I can also see the appeal of writing him as a hero. But I think Marvel can't have it both ways. The Juggernaut should either be a hero or a villain. Unfortunately, in this book, he's just kind of lost. Ron Garney's art is very enjoyable. He uses a lot of thick lines and heavy black colors that gives the book a grittiness that appeals to the Juggernaut's circumstances. And it is cool seeing him draw Kane Marco again, since he last drew the Juggernaut when he was part of the Uncanny X-Men back when Garney was the regular artist on that book some, 10 or 15 years ago. Garney can also handle the larger-than-life superhero characters as well as the quote-unquote normal people. Now, I'll keep reading this miniseries because I like the Juggernaut and I'm already halfway through it, but the story honestly just feels like filler, not that memorable. For non-Juggernaut fans, I'd skip it. And finally, for week 4, it's X of Swords Destruction. This is the final issue of the big X-Men crossover X of Swords. The Captain Britain Corps has been restored and joins the mutants of Krakoa in taking on their extra-dimensional counterparts, the mutants of Arakko. Apocalypse battling his wife Genesis, which kind of is a weird name for her to have, as a few years earlier there was that young clone of Apocalypse running around and he called himself Genesis, but whatever. He defeated her last issue and won the contest for Krakoa, but this evil helmet that controls the demons that conquered Arakko possesses her, and this leads to an all-out fight between both forces. It's really, really complicated. We get a massive battle and a final resolution between the mutant nations. This book is written by X-Men Uberlord Jonathan Hickman and Teenie Howard, who writes Excalibur, and has previously in that book set up the stuff with Apocalypse and Otherworld, which is where this tournament takes place. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend starting right on this issue, the one-shot special that wraps up the entire crossover. On its own, it's a fine issue. Great art by Pepe Larraz, and it changes the status quo for the X-Men by removing 2 members of the ruling council and establishing a second mutant nation of Arakko. But the crossover itself was too long and uneven. I mean, the first third is just getting the swords they need for this big battle, and the next 2 thirds are the battle itself. And this didn't need to involve every single mutant title. I'm looking at you, Hellions, in single issue of X-Factor. There was a lot of cool design work with the Arakko mutants, but they set the competition up as this big series of sword duels, and then halfway through it becomes a bunch of party games. There's drinking games, a marriage between 2 people who've never met each other before. Somehow that's a contest. Puzzles, games. You sold me on life or death sword fights, and there are hardly any casualties in this book. And towards the end of this crossover, not in this issue, but before that, the X-Men were losing by a huge margin, and then there's an overly convenient way in which they get all tied up. This individual issue is fine, but honestly, X of Swords has been the first major stumble of the Hickman era of X books. It's overly grand, unnecessary, and confusing. Thank you for joining me, my friends. This has been November 2020. I'll see you back here next month for the final reviews of 2020 for the month of December? Yeah, December. Until then, this is What the H Are You Reading, and I'm your host, Brian Heinz.